So, I'll just start. The Chinese Exclusion Act documentary, I think, was very well made, and I really appreciate it. Watching the documentary, I actually learned a lot of things which I never knew before. Like how the biggest mass lynching was committed against Chinese, or how it was a Chinese person who caused, or who was the reason for everyone born in the U.S. being a U.S. citizen. These things I had no idea about, which is completely weird because I'm a Chinese American myself. So you'd figure that I would know about it. See, the problem is, everyone knows about the Holocaust. That's great. Everyone knows how the Jews were oppressed. Everyone knows about Japanese internment. Everyone knows about that. But no one knows about the Chinese Exclusion Act or the specifics about it. Everyone just kind of knows that, oh, the Chinese were excluded at that one point. And that's about the end to the story. In our history classes, it's not really a focus. We cover it maybe 1 or 2 weeks, but that's about it. It's not on the forefront of people's mind. It's not in our collective consciousness. It's not as present as other tragedies such as the Holocaust or other tragedies such as Japanese internment. And it really should be, because it's a terrible thing. This is one thing that we need to do. We can't let history repeat itself. We all know there are a lot of tensions right now between America and China with the trade wars. And if we want to prevent something bad from happening to Chinese Americans, we have to remind people of what has happened already. Chinese Exclusion Act, mass lynching, burning raids where people just burn down Chinatown. All of these things need to be at the forefront of people's minds so they make sure that history does not repeat itself. Secondly, Chinese Americans have to show how they have contributed to the American community. Right now, people think of Chinese, they think, oh, they come here and they take our engineering jobs. But let's be real. And that's not what we want to contribute to society. We have contributed a lot. In the Chinese Exclusion Act, we took many of our cases to court. We tried to build precedent for a more inclusive, diverse, and equal America. That's what we want to stress. That's what we want people to know. So I think we want to do something similar to this Chinese Exclusion Act documentary. The Chinese Exclusion Act documentary, in my eyes, is trying to spread the word of our story, like I was talking about. They want to spread our story so that Chinese Americans know where they came from. So Chinese Americans know their history, and so that they won't be satisfied with just, I don't know, becoming another software engineer. They will be like, hey, my predecessors have done this. My predecessors have suffered the greatest mass lynching in America. My predecessors have caused all people born in the U.S. to be U.S. citizens. We want to remember what our predecessors have done and live up to their standards. And by giving more exposure to this problem, by giving more exposure to our story, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and all the other things surrounding it, I hope that we can create a more diverse, equal, and free America. Thank you.
So the Chinese Exclusion Act was made into law in 1882, and it wasn't repealed until 1943. So that's a whole entire 62 years, and 62 years is a very long time. So what mainly drove the creation of such an absurd law? Primarily is because the Chinese people here were working hard to create a happy life for themselves. They came to this land, were willing to work for $1 a day, and they gradually became quite wealthy. From this point, the Europeans of the land got quite annoyed at the fact that these foreigners were stealing their jobs and their money. So from these factors, the idea of the Chinese Exclusion Act became a law. So initially this law was meant to last 10 years, but then it was renewed in 1882, once again in 1902, and then was set to declared to be lasting indefinitely in 1904. Throughout these years, the activists did fight to seek change, writing letters to the president, as well as taking cases to court. But the involvement of people also grew, gradually increased, and between 1885 and 1882 and 1905, 10,000 lawsuits were filed against the federal court. And then shortly after, 100,000 Chinese refused to register for the internal passport, making the biggest act of civil disobedience in history. But then again, these actions still had very little effect. So then how did the change occur? It overall is summed up by this documentary into 3 lucky things that happened. First off was the earthquake in San Francisco. So first, yes, an earthquake does not seem to be viewed as something that's good, but it caused lots of damage in the city and destroyed the San Francisco Chinatown, but it also destroyed the records of the Chinese immigrants, which allowed for them to bring more people from China to the United States through systems such as the paper sun system. Another factor was World War II, which helped strengthen the relationship between the United States and China as they fought together against Japan. And then lastly was that the fact that the Supreme Court had an overall objective point of view and focused on what did and did not violate the Constitution rather than the idea that Chinese Americans were taking the opportunities of the Europeans. And as a whole, this documentary brings us that we, Chinese people, cannot hope that luck will be sufficient to enact change for the better of our lives. In this case, if something such as the earthquake did not happen, the repealment of the Chinese Exclusion Act could have been delayed by a lot of years. This documentary showed me personally that we should not only focus on improving our lives, but positively impacting the lives of others for things such as equal treatment and equal rights. This also shows that we need to be more involved in our community and have a say in our society. And I think that like all the Chinese Americans banded together to form such a big act of civic disobedience, real change to our communities can only be possible with strong action involving people coming together. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ethan, and so I'd like to start off by noting several interesting points I found while reading the transcript for the documentary, mainly that Chinese immigrants were initially welcomed by Americans, mainly because they were willing to do the dirty work, such as toiling on the construction of the Pacific railroads and other similar tasks. And yet, once Chinese immigrants began, taking the jobs of these same Americans who initially welcomed them, they were largely excluded, and there was a certain bias against them from these Americans who initially welcomed them. And so I think these 2 points communicate a greater theme that's still prevalent within today's society, and that's this theme of selfishness and self-servitude. I think Americans today are corrupted by their own self-satisfaction, in that they're willing to throw anyone under the dirt so long as they come out on top. I think a key example of this is our current president. He lashes out and condemns any opposition that's thrown towards him in order to feel support for his own presidency. And so he's deliberately throwing his opposition in the dirt so that he comes out on top. And so I think it is important more than ever that we communicate the importance of civic engagement within our society. Being involved in the community and looking out for those who can't fend for themselves will definitely go a long way towards reducing these feelings of selfishness that run deep within our country, even to this day.
Okay, so I'm Pranay, and I go to Interlake, and I kind of just want to start off talking about something that Edwin said, which is kind of about how relatively unknown the Chinese Exclusion Act was, even though it was a law that lasted over 60 years and happened well into the 20th century, and has still a part of some of the living probably your ancestors or some of the people who lived in America's ancestors' lives. And I would say that, interestingly enough, we spent a lot of time on it in my APUSH class 2 years ago, mainly because of the demographics of my class, just because it was kind of very poignant for many of the students. But I would say in other parts of America still it's relatively unknown, especially in many white-dominated or other race-dominated areas. And it's something that I think people need to see more, especially in other areas, just so they get a kind of a feel of what other American citizens who aren't white but still are American citizens might be feeling. And I don't really want to go too much into the history in my speech because I know that we all saw the documentary and a lot of other people will be talking about why it was repealed or why it was put in place. But I kind of want to talk about the effects and some of the effects that I see. So personally, I wasn't affected by the Chinese Exclusion Act because I have 0 ancestors from China, and yeah. So personally, I would say I wasn't affected, but I do still see some relevance in today's climate. So again, the fact that a law like this, it was really stunning to me that a law like this persisted well into almost halfway into the 20th century and was repealed like around 70 years ago, which seems relatively recent and seems kind of like a step back for our country, or kind of, in my mind, put like my mindset of the country a little bit back, because I used to always think of America as this forward-thinking place. Ever since the 1800s, we would accept all people, and unlike maybe some other countries in Europe that still had these kind of human rights violations and injustices, that we were still we kind of put ourselves in front of that even in hard times. But kind of the anger and the feeling of doubt that I saw in the documentary by the people who tried to exclude the Chinese and show them as other was kind of startling to me. And I think it's something that we've progressed, but is also still exists in today's environment. So, for example, I think that we've greatly progressed from that time, because it's almost wholehearted support for the Chinese American citizens and the Chinese American citizens who existed in that time from the U.S. legislation and from the government. So, for example, I kind of looked up on Wikipedia after I read the documentary just to get like a little summary when I was preparing for my speech, and I saw that in 2014, which is just around 3 or 4 years ago, states like California passed laws that actively honored and put into place like days to honor immigrants who were affected by the Chinese Exclusion Act and whose ancestors were affected by the Chinese Exclusion Act. So I understand, and I like the fact that we're trying to repair our relations and repair what was done that kind of harmed some of the citizens. And that's really a step forward. We have a more progressive mindset. But I would also say that some of the ways we treat other races is kind of echoes back to history and echoes back to this time where a lot of the times American citizens put all of their problems onto one race or one specific scapegoat, so they can kind of feel like they're on top, or that maybe it's not their fault. And I don't really want to go into like examples, but I know that like for sure that's kind of a concern, and that's kind of why we have this divide in America today. And I just kind of want to echo the point that that kind of talking about these issues is one way to move past it. Like, for example, even like this talk, or like American Immigration Forums, which is a part of Pathways now. Just going to events like that and talking with people, even if they're Chinese, like even like people who are Chinese talking to other Chinese people, or people who are of a different race talking to other Chinese people, it really kind of opens up like a conversation, which has, in my opinion, just been starting to open up in the American government. And if we have like citizens do this, then we can maybe prevent something like this from happening in the future, and we can finally take that step forward instead of taking maybe half steps. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Caleb. I'm from Interlink. And what I wanted to talk about was that really had an impact on me was, as I was reading the transcript for the documentary, I realized they really pointed out the idea that at the core of the reason behind the Chinese Exclusion Act was that Chinese immigrants were asking for lower wages than white Americans were willing to work for, right? Chinese Americans, Chinese immigrants, were able to offer the cheap labor that a lot of white Americans didn't want to offer. So really what Chinese immigrants did to deserve the Chinese Exclusion Act was that they risked their lives working on the Transcontinental Railroad to better the country for inhumanely low wages. And as a Korean American myself and Korean immigrant, as I was reading this transcript, I ironically couldn't help but feel involved. Because although the Chinese Exclusion Act is, in my memory, like the first and only immigration prohibition act to really point out like a single race of people, I, as a Korean American, felt included. And as different as I thought I was from Chinese people when I was, in third grade or younger, growing up in Korea, I realized that when I came to the U.S., like as often as I would tell someone that I was Korean, like I would always just be Chinese to them. And as much as I told people that I was Korean, I would just be Asian. So what I realized was that in America, Koreans, Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, Taiwanese, we all form special ties that we really can't in our own countries. And that's because, here we're all Asian. And there's like a brotherhood of some sort that I feel. And the reason I bring this up is because the reasoning behind the Chinese Exclusion Act and like the whole like formation of it is freakishly similar to Trump's policy to or his proposed policy to build a wall between Mexico and the United States. And his reasoning was that Mexicans, especially undocumented Mexicans in particular, were taking jobs that white Americans supposedly needed and wanted to work higher wages for. And that wall obviously didn't take place. I don't know who we would be if the wall did take place. But right now, immigration, getting a green card, getting a visa, even a citizenship, or especially a citizenship, has become harder than ever. And this is mainly impacting people in the Middle East and Central and South America. And yeah, the Chinese Exclusion Act has been repealed for a while now. And a lot of us don't face the same racism that Muslims or black people do today. But I don't know who we would be as Asian Americans if we just sort of turn a blind eye to these people and say, just because, you're a Latino, I can't relate to you and your struggles with immigration because we're all immigrants, right? We're all either first-generation immigrants, we're all children of immigrants, or we're descendants of immigrants. And in the end, this is what connects us all. So, yeah, thank you.
Hello everyone, I am Andrew. I go to Newport. So I want to start off with something Edwin mentioned, which is not many of us know the Chinese Exclusion Act. We hear of the Japanese internment stuff, the Holocaust stuff, but nothing about the Chinese Exclusion Act. In addition, modern day movements such as Black Lives Matter and LGBTQ kind of emphasize the history of discrimination against blacks and gay people. But none of them really say anything about the history of Chinese immigrants. So in the documentary, it really shows that Chinese Americans do have a history of discrimination. It's just that no one talks about it. And the Chinese Exclusion Act also paved the way for future discrimination, such as against the Japanese. And they're really they take away personal freedoms and personal liberties that define America, and kind of make up the American ideals. But that really draws attention to what the American ideals are. And they're just ideals that we made just so we could feel like we're all one people in one country. Although at the end of the day, we just really group up with whoever we look like or whoever our skin color looks like. And so in the Chinese Exclusion Act, the majority, basically it was a simple majority taking advantage over the minority. And that's all there is to it. The white people didn't like how the Chinese laborers were taking away jobs and basically decreasing opportunities. So in return, they just banned Chinese immigrants from going to America. And in modern day, kind of like what someone said over here, this connects to what Caleb said about the wall and Trump's policy with Trump's wall And it can also relate to the Trump's policy with the Middle East countries, because although we're not banning people from their countries because of economic opportunities, we're banning them for invalid security or national security reasons. And also with the rising tensions with China trade, and a recent article I read how a Chinese student was suspected of stealing national documents about some science thing at Duke University. It's ever more important to have discussions about how we can stop this kind of discrimination and make sure that history doesn't repeat itself ever again. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
Hi, I'm Megan, and I go to Interlake High School. Okay, so obviously we all watched the documentary. It was about the Chinese Exclusion Act, but I think that once you stripped away like the technicalities and like the specific like policies of the Chinese Exclusion Act, it doesn't really matter that it was about the Chinese Exclusion Act, because if you look at it closely, the nature and the sentiments behind the Chinese Exclusion Act, it's like basically the same. It's basically parallel between that and a whole bunch of acts in America's history. So, for example, the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, the Johnson-Reed Act in 1924, Japanese internment during World War II, and even what's going on now. And in all these instances, you can see that the reason underlying people's support for these acts is that they're afraid of these foreign aliens coming and replacing them possibly. Because, as Ethan said, at first Chinese immigrants were welcome because people weren't afraid of them. They didn't feel threatened that the Chinese immigrants would take their jobs or become essential to the economy. But later on, as they realized that the economy became more and more reliant on these Chinese workers who are able to provide labor for low wages, and as the economy became more and more reliant on these workers, people began feeling threatened. They began feeling replaced by these people who are so different from them, who are coming from a different country and yet are becoming so essential to your own country's economy. So because people are afraid of these changing demographics and the changing economic structure, and they're afraid of the fact that they might become replaced, if you think about it this way, then it becomes a pretty understandable fear, because in almost all these cases you can see that the media, it plays a really important role in stoking people's fears and propagating them. So like during the Chinese Exclusion Act, there were a lot of stereotypes being presented about Chinese men and women, and about how Chinese immigrants were the cause of all the white labor's troubles. And similarly, during the 1940s, when Japanese internment started, Japanese immigrants were being painted as dangerous because due to World War II, or they were morally lacking and more susceptible to committing crimes, more so than white people. And so the way the media portrayed these Japanese immigrants made people believe in their own fears even more. And even today, we see like the same repeat of like sensationalized claims against groups of people like Muslims that make them seem more dangerous than maybe we know that they are. So we see this repeat that during times of tension like this, people, they have a choice to make between either their fear of the foreigners and their morals. And as a result, a lot of people let like their instinct to protect themselves and to keep themselves safe take precedence over their morals and whether what they're doing is morally right. And this choice is subconscious for a lot of people. So I think that maybe if more people had conversations about this and became more aware of this choice that they're making choosing between like the things that they're afraid of and choosing a path that is morally right, like that act in of itself is essential for creating a place that is more welcoming for immigrants, to diversify America and decrease the repetition of sentiments and tragedies such as this in the future.
Sarah. I'm a freshman at Lakeside, and so after watching the documentary, one of my main emotions was disgust. Disgust at the injustice that had taken place against the Chinese people. And like Edwin said before, I was mainly disgusted at myself because I didn't know about the mass lynchings, the death, and destruction that had taken place in America. As far as I knew about Chinese immigration into America, I knew that to get in, Chinese people would go to Mexico first, paint their faces, and then cross the border saying, "Hey, ¿qué pasa?" and then they'd be let in. I didn't know about all the horrible things that had happened. So having grown up in modern Bellevue, I never experienced a lot of racial segregation. For the past 3 years of my life, I went to Odell, where everyone else was equally as short and Chinese as me. So I never had experienced any discrimination. But there was one time in kindergarten where I believe I became aware of the baggage that came with being Asian. So it all started with shrimp chips. Now, shrimp chips were a real snack for me. I brought one such bag to kindergarten snack time. Munching happily on them with a rainstorm of crumbs cascading down everywhere, I was oblivious to two boys sauntering over. Tauntingly, one of them asked what I was eating. Not understanding his tone, I offered him one. He pushed it away and asked, "Aren't these your eyes?" He reached up and stretched his eyes into thin lines. His friend laughed, doing the same. They pretended to bump into each other and fall, the first one yelling, "I can't see! I can't see!" I forgot to chew the last chip. I forgot how to chew. I looked around the room frantically for someone to notice. The teacher was on her laptop, the students were all talking to each other. They continued going on, talking about dragon festivals and imitating my Chinese accent, my non-existent Chinese accent. Lowering my head, I felt a rush of emotions that I never felt before. Shame to be Chinese. I was ashamed to be Chinese and to be my own race. I was embarrassed, and of course I was helpless because there was nothing I could do to speak up against it. Shrimp chips were a real treat for me, but in that moment in kindergarten snack time, I'd become just another identical piece in a bag of shrimp chips, lost and not unique. As I thought back to that, it connected to the documentary because it seemed that discriminating against Chinese people was easy and acceptable. The stereotypes are hard to get particularly mad at. According to them, Chinese people are smart, pale, small-eyed, good at math, and only ever eat dumplings. It wasn't bad to be pale and have small eyes, and being smart was a compliment, and dumplings are delicious. None of them struck me as particularly horrible, and yet they weren't extreme as stereotypes for other races. But it was still generalizing an entire race. It was taking around 1.4 billion people and saying, "Hey, you're the identical shape and size, we can't tell you apart." So I think the documentary is really important to spread around to Chinese Americans just like us so we can speak up about it in the future and make sure the Chinese Exclusion Act doesn't repeat itself in the future. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kevin. I go to Inglemoor. The Chinese Exclusion Act was a bill passed by U.S. President Chester Arthur. The act basically cut off almost all immigration from China from 1882 to 1943 and prohibited Chinese people from earning American citizenship. And it's the only federal legislation in United States history ever to single out and name a specific race and nationality for exclusion from immigration and citizenship. Not only showed extreme racism demonstrated by U.S. immigration policy, but also served as a template for later exclusion of other immigrants and the regulation and restriction of even more European immigration. Just like the Muslim ban of January 27th and an executive order by U.S. President Donald Trump banning citizens of 7 Muslim majority countries to enter the United States and earning visas. The documentary showed beyond doubt that the passage of the 1882 Act emboldened white racists and led to a surge in violence against Chinese immigrants already in the U.S. A rising belief of ethnic cleansing and how kicking out all unwanted ethnicity, those who are unfit to be American, will make America better. This belief rationalized violence against Chinese immigrants and made racism look progressive for the Americans, which in turn fueled their ego and belief. Under such circumstances, the Chinese people in America didn't just bow down. They chose to come to America for a reason. They came to this country because of its belief of freedom and how everyone has a right to become the person they wish to be. You're not going to go down without a fight. I admire their bravery, standing up and protecting the dreams of millions of Chinese people, Chinese immigrants, so that more people can share this opportunity of becoming themselves. Standing up for their belief of freedom, that no people, no country, no race should be forcibly excluded from anything. And more importantly, standing up for America, who tried with all their might to correct the American people and change what they're doing wrong, fighting not just for their belief, but every immigrant's right to be American. Thank you.
Hi there, so I'm David, I'm a junior at Issaquah High. So the Chinese Exclusion Act documentary on PBS detailed the painful history of Chinese immigration into the United States. It detailed the journey of how a regional case of racism and discrimination against Chinese Americans in the state of California, fueled by a stagnant economy and the frustration of poor working class whites, led to the first piece of national legislation where we targeted a race for not being able to enter our country. This mistake has left a stain on this country's history for the next 60 years. What the feature really put into sharp relief for me was how the United States, a country founded on the fundamental principles of liberty, equality, and justice, found itself on the path of excluding others. To me, it really illuminated how, in the most dire of circumstances, when America faced real troubles, we strayed from our ideals, and we decided to not uphold them. This passage from the documentary from a workers' representative in Chicago in 1869 really sums it up best. We warn working men that a new and dangerous foe looms up in the far west. Already, our brothers of the Pacific have had to meet it, and as soon as the Pacific Railroad is completed, these Chinamen will swarm through the Rocky Mountains. We must not sleep until the foe is upon us, but commence to fight him now. In the name of all the working men of our common country, we demand that our government forbid another Chinaman to step upon our shores. This passage shocked me because I didn't expect an American to refer to another American who was already in America as a foe in the 1800s. It drew too many parallels with our modern immigration debate. In our present time, where we call Mexicans criminals and rapists, and we find that to be, and some people find that to be acceptable, it felt like it was too reminiscent of our present era. Which brings me to my concluding point. The history of the Chinese Exclusion Act is a tragic chapter in American history, and it teaches us a very valuable lesson. And the lesson that acceptance is part of what made this country great, and that we must not lose sight of our founding ideals, even when it is tempting to blame others for our problems. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Christina. I'm a junior from Interlake High School. So the Chinese Exclusion Act was the first law that restricted immigrants from entering the United States due to their race and class. Through this law, Chinese workers were specifically banned for various reasons. One of the reasons, as explained on the legal documents, was that the United States claimed that the Chinese workers are harmful to the nation. But is it really the truth? As a nation that promises its people for liberty and justice, why would they pass this act? So in my history class, I did this history paper on the Chinese Exclusion Act, and what I found out is that these hardworking Chinese workers, mine workers and railroad workers were indeed scapegoats of the white people's jealousy. They think the Chinese workers stole money and resources from them. They think the Chinese immigrants are aliens just simply because they can't speak English. After watching the documentary, I realized that this is not the only time Chinese Americans or Chinese were discriminated against in this nation, and similar phenomenon happens in other countries too. And not only Chinese Americans, but also people of other races and ethnicities are discriminated against in this nation, and they're grossly generalized. Even today, Harvard, one of the most elitist university is sued by a group of Chinese Americans because of racial discrimination in their admission process. Well, I do not know if Harvard did discriminate against Chinese American students or Chinese students, but what I do know is that we have to fight for injustice. We need to have our own voice heard. Which is why I joined this internship, because I think this is a great opportunity for me to express what I think through civic engagement. Thank you.
Alright, so hi guys. So obviously we're talking about Chinese Exclusion Act, but one thing about the Chinese Exclusion Act, we all know it's like super horrible, but no one really knows about the Chinese Exclusion Act. That's basically what everyone else said, but why do they not know about what the Chinese Exclusion Act? Because they don't care. Like, honestly, America and like every single other country is people, natives first. Because they live there, the government is run by natives, they want to keep it like that. And so if they get problems because of us, then we're out. Like, alright, so like the gold miners, they're like, there's like, it could be the Chinese or those hydraulic mining companies that keep on taking our jobs. Definitely not hydraulic mining companies, definitely Chinese. Let's go kick them out and like kill all of them. Like, not give them any citizenships. And so, I mean, that's basically the nature of immigrants coming and trying to find jobs in different countries. They're taking away American jobs, or like it's the same thing in Europe with Syrian refugees. They just don't like them because taking away jobs. And like you think Chinese Exclusion Act, this is like maybe 50 years ago, but still, if you try to get to college, and I know most of us are Asian here, it's still gonna be hella hard to get in there. Like if you get the same score as like gonna be a white guy, who's going in? White guy. Why? Because we prioritize the people who won't take away our jobs. Because those people are us, and like, yeah, minorities, African Americans. People care about them. Why? Because African Americans force them to care about them. All the NFL stars, top 100 artists of the week, and you'll find a lot of them. They have a lot of influence, but you are not going to find a single Chinese NFL star that people know. Like, there's one Korean kicker for the Chargers called Young Ho Kim. He's got cut. But and like, have you ever seen a Chinese like artist, like rapper, or maybe Hired Brothers, but not really? Like, have you ever seen them go on the top 100 songs of the week or day? No, because we can't force Americans to, or the natives to. They aren't going to let us come in and take their jobs. But the thing is, that's kind of wrong, because when we come, we bring opportunities to them. Like, we built the railway. That obviously helped America a lot, because it helped America connect the Pacific and the West Coast. And even today, we bring our knowledge and technology and everything to America. And it helps America because it helps to develop more technology, new ideas, new skill sets. And that improves America. And you may say, oh yeah, take away our jobs, get out here. But like, no. These new skill sets open up new career paths, etc. So it just doesn't work. All right, thank you.
Hi, my speech is a little more chill. My name is Suhan. I'm a junior at Interlake. So I'm going to start off my speech with a little story. So a few weeks ago, my dad and I went to Safeway to pick up some groceries. We were at the front of the self-checkout line, and I saw an open register area. While walking towards it, I saw that there was a can of like peas or something still on the checkout area, but I assumed that it was accidentally left there by a random customer. Suddenly, I heard a loud voice screaming, "No, no, no," at us. I turned around, and there was a middle-aged white woman running towards us. When she got to the register area, she told me, "I didn't know how to stop you. I don't know how to say no in Asian." At first, I couldn't speak because there were so many thoughts in my head. Most of them were words I will not say out loud right now. When I finally could speak again, I told her in a very calm voice that I could speak English. She was utterly shocked. She then proceeded to tell me that she was rude because she got surgery. I've never really heard anyone justify racism with surgery, but yay for learning new things every day. So, how does this relate to the Chinese Exclusion Act? I believe that even though the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943, the effects are still permanent. Even now, Americans mark the Chinese as different and in some aspects even undesirable. The act created the notion that Chinese immigrants and people are aliens, and that notion still exists today and probably will never be erased. When describing the opium trade in China, I was reminded of many of the document-based questions we did in AP US history, specifically the ones portraying Chinese men to be very foreign, with abnormally large heads, small slanted eyes, and very inferior demeanors in general. The Chinese immigrants were depicted to march around the nation to take over American jobs. It is so upsetting how Westerners viewed the Chinese, not just physically, but also as an economic source. They tried their best to appease the Chinese, and when they couldn't, they resorted to illegal tactics to use China just for its economic appeal. The irony about the entire act and events surrounding it is very peculiar. The Chinese came to America for opportunities, just like how America was established, but were shamed and demonized for it. And even worse, Americans didn't view the Chinese to be threatening because they were of equal status, but because there were just a lot of foreigners invading the country. Chinese immigrants themselves realized the irony in the treatment from Americans as well. The Declaration of Independence said that all men were created equal, but the Chinese certainly weren't treated equally. Near the middle of the documentary, historian John something described the Chinese massacre of 1871, which included the burning of the LA Chinatown, where whites and Mexicans captured Chinese people, lynched them, hanged them from the church steeples, covered wagons and gateposts. They dropped flaming torches into buildings and burned down Chinatown. The event was recorded as the largest mass lynching in the history of the United States. I remember learning that Chinatowns were very sacred to the Chinese because it was an area where they could take a break from the pressing social tensions and negative reactions towards Chinese immigrants. Their only safe haven was destroyed just because they wanted to find new opportunities in the so-called land of opportunities. What really shocked me, like many others have said, was the lack of exposure on this event in modern day. In school, we learned a lot about race riots, such as the Detroit race riot and the LA race riot, but never riots based on Asian American issues, even though the Chinese massacre was the largest mass lynching ever. While many people regard the Chinese Exclusion Act as a policy of the past, we can see similar events and actions reflected in the present day, maybe of lesser degrees, but many American mindsets have not changed. The documentary ends on a rather positive note, stating that generations of Chinese Americans never give up their faith and their hope. Although I agree with this, personally, I view the Chinese Exclusion Act and its effects in a much more negative light. However, I believe that we can work together towards eliminating the detrimental effects through promoting Asian American representation in governmental levels and increasing coverage on issues such as the many events mentioned in the documentary through education for our generation. How can Congress vote on important laws regarding Asian Americans when only 15 members in the House and 3 members of the Senate are Asian Americans? Hopefully, our generation of young, bright-minded students can change that. Through increasing discourse around Asian Americans in politics, we can be the representatives for our people and help decrease stigma around Asian immigration discussions.
Hi. Oh, sorry. There you go. Hi, my name is Michelle, and I go to Interlake High School. The Asian immigrant has always been seen as the productive worker who fueled the well-oiled American machine. Their labor was not valued. It was exploited, suffocated, and squeezed out of the blood, sweat, and tears of the immigrant, tricked by the hopes of a better future. But this Chinese labor was disposable. Chinese bodies were worthless. And that's why it was so easy for congressmen to pass a law putting a blanket restriction on an entire population. And all the while, the trains that these congressmen rode to Washington, D.C. were built by the gashed hands of a Chinese man. As John Pelfer mentioned in the documentary, the bill was largely not just about labor, it was about white purity. As Edward said, and Oliver Turner write in their studies of Orientalism, one of the key portrayals of China that justified these forms of racism were the images of China as uncivilized and threatening. China's laws weren't as strong as the U.S.'s. Chinese people were uncultured, savages, immoral. Chinese people were taking over all the land, the labor, and the jobs. And the irony lies in that the U.S. never had any right to this. They stole it, they colonized it, and ripped it out of the hands of innocent peoples. Helfzer also mentions that Chinese immigrants were only valued when they were seen as hardworking and guards of a moral code. It's mirrored by the myth of the model minority that's still echoed today. Chinese Americans are seen as reaching whiteness, but still never enough. They're shoved into a mold of submissive, apathetic, and behaved, all the same. The myth sustains a paradox that Asian Americans will never be able to strip themselves of. You can either be assimilated or deviant, but in either situation, you'll never be good enough to be recognized and valued for who you are if it isn't attached to your productivity. So while Chinese people may not be physically excluded today, they're socially excluded and put into the chokehold of stereotypes that can never be broken. It's unfortunate that the documentary has mentioned that it's unfortunate about that people have forgotten about the Chinese Exclusion Act. It seems to have been hidden under layers of seemingly liberal immigration reforms, but the ghost of the past still remains in the roots of our country. People who operate under the guise of, oh, it's gotten better, forget how the exclusionary rhetoric perpetuates itself today. The exploited railroad worker of the 1800s is now the prisoner, bound under the loopholes of the 13th Amendment into slavery. The image of the yellow peril is now the justification for threats to be made against the Chinese government. The fetishization of Asian women in media hasn't even changed a bit. The words we use today may not be the same, but the ideas still thrive. However, progress isn't impossible. We have to first recognize that things are not okay at the moment, and we have to take steps to change it. There are short-term and long-term steps that everyone, Chinese or not, can take to ensure inclusion for all. The midterms elections are coming up, and under the plenary power doctrine, Congress still holds all power over immigration policy. And it isn't just immigration policy. Every piece of legislation must be passed by congressional action, and that's why we need future leaders to speak up for us. If you are of age, vote in the elections, change the course of your future, and break the myth that students, especially Chinese students, are politically apathetic. And for those who are not of age, don't be afraid to speak out. The Constitution of the United States was created under hopes of some inclusion, and we should hold the government to it. Encourage students to become politically active and at least aware. Inspire them to run for student council, then city council, and ultimately to become congresspeople. It's shocking that the lack of representations Asians have in the government right now, such as what Muhan mentioned earlier, and that's something we need to change, and something we need to change starting now.
Okay, so I'm Aaron, and I go to Newport High School. So I like the documentary a lot. Since I didn't know too much about the Chinese exclusion prior to this week, but I knew a little bit. But after this week, I learned definitely a lot of new things. And yeah, so I guess here's some main points that stuck out to me as I was watching the documentary, or as I reflected it after I watched it. So, when we look back into the Chinese Exclusion Act, I think it begs the question of what it means to be American, and who can be an American citizen in the first place. And it seems pretty intuitive that anyone that comes to America should be able to gain citizenship in America. And the documentary talked about the 14th Amendment, which said that anybody in America can gain citizenship if they're born in America or they're naturalized in the United States. However, when we can see from the Chinese Exclusion Act, clearly that's not true, and not everybody can be an American citizen, as specifically the Chinese Americans were excluded from being from gaining their citizenship, which is not upholding the 14th Amendment. And clearly there was some form of racial prejudice underpinning this Exclusion Act. So I think this form of racial prejudice is kind of reminded me about it's similar to the 1700s, about how white people earlier had a trouble justifying slavery in the 1700s after they gained their freedom and independence from Britain, because the Americans, while they were still with the British, they thought they weren't getting fair and equal representation, and talked about these American ideals of liberty, justice, and freedom, and then they gained independence from Britain while they still had African American slaves who definitely did not have the same equal rights as other white Americans. And so I think this sort of racial problems are also evident in things today, what other people have talked about, immigration problems towards Latino people and people in the Middle East not being able to come to America. So another thing, another important thing as I was watching the documentary was when it talked about how Chinese Americans came into California looking for work just like other Americans, and other Americans saw them as these foreigner threats to their labor, just the racial threats. And there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment leading up to the Chinese Exclusion Act, and there was this posing question about whether or not Chinese people could be American in the first place. And I think this made the Chinese people look at outsiders or foreigners, and they were unable to assimilate into American culture. And I think these impacts of the Chinese Exclusion Act are still prevalent today when we think about the ideas of the Chinese as this perpetual foreigner, and these stereotypes that we see today towards Chinese Americans, and various ideas that are still discussed about Chinese Americans are pretty prevalent today. And the obvious fact is that many Chinese Americans are not very don't participate in American politics, which kind of shows this idea of them not really participating as Americans. Finally, the documentary talked about how many people don't know about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and thing about this
thinking about this, it's kind of true because a lot of like areas like in education don't talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act at all. They talk like a lot about Native Americans or African Americans, but they don't discuss like racial tensions that like came about with Asian Americans. And I think it's so many Americans are oblivious to this, but I think it's important that like we learn about the Chinese Exclusion Act just like any other historical event, because it's important understanding like history and understanding what's happening today and how history has led up to like various like social problems going on right now.
Okay, hello, my name is Alex, I go to Interlake. So imagine the scene of the gold rush, a new market for profit and search for riches. But too afraid to risk their lives, the white workers, they brought the Chinese to America, and it's called the land of the free, to mine the gold for them. People detested the Chinese for their ways because not only were they considered culturally inferior, but economically they stole from the jobs of the poor white American workers as they saw it. This was further exemplified when the railroad to China, or the transcontinental railroad from the East Coast to California, was built by the Chinese because super cheap labor. You only have to pay $1 a day. And jealous of the skill of the Chinese, the federal government decided it was time to rid of a cultural invasion, at least how they described it in their mind. So I guess my major takeaway was how politically, economically, and socially selfish America then and even now is. And let me get this straight. It's not bad to be selfish. In terms of selfishness, I'm talking about why do you let people control you? So probably it's because you fear the consequences of what happens if you don't follow them, or you believe that it's the key to a better future. Those are all selfish reasons. You're thinking about what's going to benefit you. So by selfish, I'm talking about like the innate, unconscious selfishness of American government. So political hypocrisy, what is written in the Constitution and the amendment, is extremely inconsistent with the action of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So the 14th Amendment granted all native-born citizenship for the United States, and that's good for the Chinese back then, because ultimately they would be able to get the citizenship into the United States. But under the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Chinese were banned from further immigration into the country, and it specifically banned Chinese women from entering the country, and that technically went against the 14th Amendment, which indirectly would have given Chinese the ability to accumulate themselves as citizens of the United States. And without women, there's no reproduction, which means that there can't be any Chinese citizens. So this selfishness, I guess this hypocrisy it even relates to African Americans, because after the 15th Amendment, which at least gave African Americans or all citizens the right to vote, grandfather clauses and literacy tests in the South were used to prevent blacks from being able to vote in the South. So I guess economically, we see a very protectionist point of view. This is obviously before the Holly Smoot tariff was released, but the American fear of Chinese stealing their jobs was obviously like the primary mover for creating the act. And unfortunately, we see this as an issue today with the trade war between the U.S. and China and Donald Trump's tariff. And this is one of the reasons why we restrict a pathway to citizenship for less fortunate peoples, fear of those illegal immigrants stealing our jobs. And I guess this is also as Donald Trump's fear. And then this really doesn't make any sense, because if they worked hard to be able to obtain the job that they could get in America, then they deserve to have the position. Why should we reserve it for Americans? Because America is a free country, and it's a country where people have to work in order to obtain results. So, and then I guess socially, in the back of our mind, one thing that stood out is innately how superior we think America is. And then one of the things that struck out was, I guess during the time of the Exclusion Act in California, they were insulting the Chinese for eating rats, and they were making fun of the male ponytail. And then if this is a land of equality and all naturalized can become citizens, then this is really inconsistent to what was written in the amendments and the Constitution. And it's frustrating how even today channels like Fox News, they, like, for example, while they criticized Colin Kaepernick during the Nike ad, they claimed that America has all the social justice the world could ask for, but only to lash out on black protesters for asserting their rights for the Black Lives Matter movement and lashing out against LGBT communities. So I guess this kind of raises a question. If this is the best, if we have the best social justice system in the world, then why do we have all, then for example, why is it so hard for Asian Americans? Why do Asian Americans have the lowest acceptance rate into Ivy League colleges? So American writing and action is hypocritical, it's inconsistent, and the American dream, as what we have learned in class, is in some ways just a lore that can definitely disappoint. So it's important that we not only evolve from the past and we learn from it, but we also make sure that that what is given in the Constitution and what we do match up. So.
Hi, okay, my name is Richard. I'm a sophomore at Newport High School. So after watching the Chinese Exclusion Act documentary, I thought about like how, like the Donald Trump, like there's a lot of parallels to Donald Trump as president right now, where he is segregating against groups of people like the Mexicans who are supposedly illegally crossing the borders and saying that many of them are rapists or drug dealers. And that's kind of similar to how before in America where the Chinese were kicked out because they were just like, they were all stereotyped into being these people who just take their jobs and taking their wages. And there's also similarity to how Trump's travel ban, which banned 7 countries from immigrating to the U.S., including 5 Muslim countries. And this shows how, they're kind of discriminating against specific races because they have these stereotypes against them, like Muslims, because many of the terrorists have been Muslims, and then now they just think that a majority of the Muslims will be terrorists, so they are like discriminating against them. And something like in U.S. history, the Constitution and American values all want American equality and how all men are created equal, but this opposes how they just kicked out these Chinese people because they were taking their wages, but they forgot about how their own values directly contrast this. And when the U.S. Was first made, it was an aftermath of Britain immigrating to the U.S. themselves, so they were also immigrants themselves, and they pushed out the natives so they can themselves have their own society, but this shows how like maybe they are just scared of the Chinese pushing out the Americans, similar to how the Americans pushed out the natives and took over their nation. So right now in the world right now, many people are not really exposed to this Chinese Exclusion Act because many like Chinese people in our area, they're like a lot of people are Chinese or Asian in our area, but in the whole world, many places are majority white or majority black, such as like Atlanta, which is like 70% black or something. So then people aren't really focused on the Chinese and what happened to them, which is why the Chinese Exclusion Act is not really prevalent right now. So I think that we should all practice civic engagement and try to become more involved in the society so we can remove all these Asian stereotypes of just being like engineers and working at Microsoft and stuff. Yeah.
Hello everyone, my name is Kevin Yang and I'm a sophomore at Interlake High School. And while I was reading the transcript for the Chinese Exclusion Act film, it brought to my attention the limits and contradictions in the U.S. laws and the core beliefs of the U.S. And so the Revolutionary War was fought for the principles of life, liberty, and property, or pursuit of happiness in Jefferson's point of view. And we as people after the war and after we had these beliefs, we continue to exclude people from having these things. Such as after the Revolutionary War, slaves were still in existence, so they were not equal as the white people. And women in many cases were also treated not as fairly as the white males that were like prominent in America. And then, so especially in the U.S., the core beliefs have always been in existence, have always been limited to a certain number of people. After the war, gradually, these beliefs became less limited, but discrimination and other factors still played in the role of this limitedness. So in the Chinese Exclusion Act film, we learned that the first case of discrimination against the Chinese was during the gold rush period in San Francisco, mostly. And before this happened, there were still Chinese people that immigrated to America, and they weren't being treated as unfairly or because they were valued for their good work. But I found it interesting that it was after that they started to have more gold and started taking more jobs from the American people, that the American people saw the Chinese people as enemies. And I thought that they discriminated against the Chinese people because of their own self-interest and their own selfishness. They made the Chinese foreigners act as scapegoats for their problems, so they laid everything that was going wrong with, at the time, the poor people who didn't have enough to farm or things like that. They all acted against the Chinese people and pushed all the problems on the people that they were not familiar with, the aliens. And they also created the idea. They also had the idea of white supremacy, where like freedom is largely dependent on the color of your skin or your race. And I thought it brought up to the question of whether the Chinese Exclusion Act was created because of social or economic causes. Like, did the American people believe that they were actually superior because of their race? Or did the American people create this act to limit the actions to the Chinese and allow American economy to rely more on domestic products, or like on American people? And I also find it really ironic that America as a country relies deeply on immigrants and like non-American races for their products and for their economy, yet they still try to push like immigrants out, and even though we made this country kind of. And since the founding of America, people have been using China as a trade partner and unfairly treating the Chinese people for their goods, such as we learned about in world history. We learned about how the Chinese Opium Wars and how the British people extremely wanted the Chinese goods due to their limitedness in quality. But after the Chinese people didn't want to trade with the British people because the British people had nothing to offer for the Chinese people at that time,
They illegally transported things like opium, and even though they were told to stop, they continued to do it and harm like.
Okay. I think I'm the last one. So my name's Liana, and I'm from Newport. And then from this documentary, there were several points that I didn't realize were portraying to Asians. That is like the highlight. So the first one's, just a few decades ago, we would have been considered as undesirable, culturally, biologically unfit for this society. And those are terms you don't really associate with Asians. And then there's the race riots and purges for white purity and ethnic cleansing. You think of Jews as the Holocaust, Tutsis was the Rwanda genocide, but you don't think Asian genocide in America. And the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited Chinese immigrants from becoming citizens, was implying that it was okay to start a genocide against Asians in America, which goes against every other idea we have in America. And it was like, America, you screwed up again. And I don't know how to fix that part. And then there's also the fact that the N-word, usually used for African Americans, was also used for us. And that we were also termed as coolies, which sounds a lot better in modern terms than past times. And that we were not portrayed as we are 50 years ago. And then just a state across in Idaho, there's a Snake River. And then tourists will probably go there saying, oh, it's beautiful. There's waterfalls, there's canyons. What a beautiful place to live. And then there's residents who are like, we use this river every day for, cooking, cleaning. Oh, gosh. But there's a darker side to that river, which probably most of them don't know, that the flesh and bones of Asians were once drifting down that river, and the blood has been spilled in that river, and that people are still willingly to swim in that river is weird, but but I think that just highlights how much we don't know about the Chinese Exclusion Act and what it did for 60 years, and then how resilient we are as a race against this injustice for 62 years, and that our predecessors have fought against the courts, against every single thing they could think of, to integrate the immigration policy into the 14th Amendment. And I'd just like to thank to our predecessors, which should be about 75 if they were born in the last year of 1950. Thank you for all your hard work, and we will continue to improve on the society today.